of other association, and he was a fellow of the Institute of Management Consultants who participates in the value chain analysis study on maize in Nigeria. The place is open for you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon. Okay. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So our presentation this afternoon actually have been led by Dr. Oluma and Dr. Alison and Dr. Chaputo. So I'll be presenting on their behalf. And I'm sure Dr. Oluma is here, so if there are areas that need further clarification, he will do that. Thank you. So next slide, please. Now, over many years, efforts have been directed by government to turn around the low yield, low input production agricultural system in Nigeria or in Africa generally, and often the effort has been towards implementing input subsidy programs. And many of these input subsidy programs, from what has been understood, is that they are suboptimal in that they have not been able to trigger yield increase and as well as output increase. And as such, less than expected, perform less than expected. And as a result of that, many government efforts have always directed towards tweaking the policy design, either in terms of the input delivery system, in terms of the design and the implementation of the subsidy program. Now, the question we're asking is that if these input subsidy programs have not been performing as expected, what are the options? What are the available alternatives available in order to save countless resources that have been public resources that have been expended on it? Which brought us to the key questions of our research. Is the idea of a new approach which has been discovered from research in the VCA4D research, which is the business to farmer model. And from our review, it has shown some potentials, which we are going to elaborate on in this presentation. So to address this question, we've taken some steps. First is to develop a framework of analysis, which will be presented. And then we've analyzed and reviewed literatures in Africa on input subsidy programs, particularly in Nigeria and Zambia. We also reviewed business to farmer models that have been identified in the VCA4D study, particularly for maize in Nigeria and sorghum in Ghana. We've also, to buttress our point, we've been able to tabulate a presentation, which is part of a model which was presented by Dr. Duma on Zambian egg value chain, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit more as we present. Next slide, please. So the underlying assumption of the input subsidy program is that affordability is the main limiting factor, or is the binding constraint that is limiting farmers' utilization of inputs or access to valuable inputs. But we argue in our analysis here that the affordability is not the only factor, but there are other complementary limitations which are ineffective, or complementary systems that are ineffective. And all of these complementary factors will be led to or have been led to unaddressed problems or issues, either pre-harvest and post-harvest. And the pre-harvest in the sense of the liquidity constraint that are limiting farming households, particularly during the planting season, to get the necessary input in terms of either material or labor input needed for production. And also, there's also the problems of getting quality input, the variability of the quality, which has discouraged a lot of farmers from adopting input technology. And from the post-harvest part, there's always a common knowledge of the poor access to market for output, poor access because of the price volatility. And also, there's always a problem of post-harvest losses due to a lot of infrastructural challenges, which was also mentioned here, in terms of access to transportation, which has also contributed to post-harvest losses. So these basically underline our understanding of this research that the business to farm model, which we are proposing here, quite address most of these unaddressed issues and have shown potential to provide a sustainable and inclusive growth for smallholder farmers, and thereby increasing their productivity as well as output. Next slide, please. Now, the BT for the business to farmer model, which we've reviewed in this paper, basically consists of a number of steps. One is that there are a number of few actors which are actually been working either in formal or informal arrangement. We have the large scale off-takers who could be processors, there could be grain millers, there could be end users that are processing feed for livestock consumption. What we have realized that they have better opportunity of encouraging a more sustainable and more consistent development in terms of access for farmers to the input, quality input. And the benefit for them is basically quality supply of raw materials and constant supply of raw materials for their production. Another actor in this system is the commodity aggregator, who's basically use forward contract as well as track record to secure credit from commercial banks, sometimes from donor organizations. And this is used to supply input to smallholder farmers. And these smallholder farmers basically is just to ensure that they are providing quality input and also providing them with technical advisory services to ensure that they are producing using the right recommendation, and also they are monitored to ensure that there is a possibility to avoid possibility of default or side selling among farmers, which is also a common practice. Now, the smallholder in this own case benefits from these two things. One, he gets the input at quality input. He gets access to a reliable market. And at the same time, he gets access to extension or advisory services, and which help him in delivering the right quality output. And he pays back by selling part of his output to repay for the input being supplied, and extras are sold at the same time, because most of the time, the markets are more innovative than the open market outlets. Next slide, please. Now, for analysis of these practices in Nigeria, in particular, we discovered that the input subsidy programs have basically three phases, and it has, in a way, resulted in high subsidy being paid by government. Now, there are three areas in input supply, so input subsidy programs in Nigeria. The first basically was dominated by federal government, and whereby they paid about 75% of the subsidy, and they allowed the states to take up the transportation, which basically was focused on fertilizer subsidy alone. And that later was metamorphosed into another stage, which was the second stage that involved a voucher program that was introduced around 2012. And basically that also was more focused on fertilizer supply. And in this case, there was access for private sector investment in order to make sure that it is a bit more participatory. But the limitation, which was also existing in the previous approach, was also persistent, in that there was these losses in terms of during storage as well as during transportation and late delivery, as well as a lot of leakages in the distribution system. The last phase, which was the electronic wallet system, was also introduced, and that had also took some steps in terms of limiting the leakages and ensuring proper targeting. But unfortunately, that has not worked as well, and it is existing one form or the other at the moment, and we have no resolved. And based on data available here, we could see from the analysis that the yield growth has not changed, rather it has declined or even stagnated from the data we have from National Bureau of Statistics. Next slide, please. Similar results were also discovered in Zambia, where similar project was done around 2002 to cushion the effect of the severe drought that was experienced in 2000. Basically, the idea was to introduce the input subsidy program for a period of 3 years to win out farmers who are beneficial for it by providing 50% subsidy. But that program was later transformed and changed again in around 2012, 2015, 2016. And the 50% was still maintained, but rather the electronic approach was introduced, and private sector suppliers were also encouraged to participate. To run those, just to make sure that the underlying finding was that that system has not worked also. There are still problems of access of farmers to quality input, particularly smallholder farmers who are targeted in the subsidy programs. And as a result, a lot of resources have been wasted. So of recent, around 400 million euros are spent on subsidy provision, which is about 80% of 80% subsidy provided to farmers. And as you can see from the result of the yield for maize, the production of the is still stagnated or even declined to some extent, despite the heavy subsidy that has been invested. And this finding is also consistent with the finding by Fusila in the study that we conducted recently on maize in Zambia, which also showed that there is no evidence of increase in non-subsidy input use and has not had impact on poverty reduction. Next slide, please. Now, just to kind of buttress our findings, we've also looked at other cross-country studies that have been conducted by Professor Jane. Okay, Professor Jane, and taking note of taking stock of the second generation input subsidy programs that have been conducted across Africa, and a similar study that have been conducted on 2006 Abuja Declaration of Fertilizer Use. Basically, what they are concluding is that our finding is consistent with what they are finding, and that the input subsidy program has not worked, and they have no reason of impact on poverty or in increase in input utilization. So basically what I'm trying to, where we conclude is that liquidity constraint is an important factor, and the input subsidy program has not really solved that problem of liquidity constraint. And these complementary issues could be addressed through the business to farmer model, which we've introduced in this. Next slide, please. So because of the time, there are a lot of findings that have supported this. For example, in the Ghana project, Ghana model that was done in terms of sorghum production through the planting for food and job. Similar approach was been done, and a lot of credit was provided to farmers to produce. But unfortunately, the subsidy is quite high, about 50% in subsidy to our credit to farmers. And despite the fact that the model has worked in some places, but in the case of Ghana, it actually provided the result I expected because there was increase in the yield area cultivated was also higher. Also, the output they were getting was also better than those farmers who are non-beneficiaries of this approach. The post-harvest losses, which is a major factor, was also quite less, about 35%, even lower than those who are not participating in this project. The return on investment was marginally high, especially particularly among the participants. Although we will argue that the margin was not large enough because of the operating cost as well as the cost of the input that are being used by farmers. So, but in terms of the income, the effect was quite significant, as we can see that those participants had a significantly higher returns, income above the poverty line, and which is an important finding from this study. Next slide, please. Well, the result in Nigeria also shows similar, that the B2F approach or the model has encouraged farmers to actually have cultivate more land, and the returns on investment was also very high, and the tons produced by quality farmer was about 2.5 tons per hectare, which is about 20% higher than non-participating farmers. Although it's important to highlight the issues of these mid-scale operators or mid-scale farmers who are cultivating much higher return on investment. And I think it's important to also, one of the findings of this study is that most of the participants, those smallholder farmers who are benefiting from the B2F approach, often at times expand or spread their input to other beyond the recommendation that provided to them, and as such that could have implication on their yield. And that's why the margin between the smallholder farmers who are participating in the B2F and the small and the medium scale operators were quite high. There's a difference of 2.1 and 3.5 tons per hectare. But in terms of post-harvest losses, maybe I will explain that further probably during the question and answer also. There were different approaches that are taken in Ghana and in Nigeria to minimize post-harvest losses. For example, in Ghana, there was provision of tampolin during drying, which was also helping in minimizing post-harvest losses. There was this small village stores, which help farmers to store their product rather than saving them at home, which also exposes them to post-harvest losses. These are some of the approaches. In Nigeria, there was this hematic bag that were introduced, which also saved the use of chemicals that are harmful, and that also will help in coming down post-harvest losses. So these are some of the benefits of the B2F approach. beside the extension advisory services that are provided that help to increase their experiences and following the recommendation. So in terms of income, the returns on investment was quite higher, far above the poverty line, and compared to those who are not participating, is our finding. And also the environmental impact is very clear, because the higher the income and as well as the yield, the lower the impact on environment. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, it's clear from these findings that the V2F approach have actually shown some promise, and it has shown that it's sustainable and inclusive. And we believe that by adopting some of this model, although it's not the best of all, but there's still more effort needed in terms of fine-tuning in order to optimize it. And I believe that part of the recommendation would be to conduct more research to fine-tune the approach and make it a bit more sustainable, addressing some of the limitations of the approach. For example, in the weak bargaining power of the farmers in the pricing system, as well as overcoming the limitations of finances and some of the constraints that have been faced by the participating farmers. But overall, the approach is promising and it's sustainable, and we believe that is something that can be looked at. Okay, I think the next slide, maybe I'll conclude by that. Okay, I think, okay. So basically, this is something I've mentioned, and I believe that it's important. One other point I also want to mention in this finding is that the challenges of the business challenges of this financial production, because most of the approaches that have been done are leveraging on the aggregators only, focusing on providing the financial support. We believe that that shouldn't be exclusive. There are other approaches of accommodating farmers and linking them with the input producers, and also ensuring that they are reduced accordingly, rather than just exclusively focusing on the aggregators. And we believe there's some problem in transparency in terms of institutionalizing the transfer, the negotiation, and believing in also repayment of input delivered to farmers. So basically, I think these are just basically what we have here, and we believe more can be done if maybe during the question. Thank you very much.